Okay. So you all are here today to hear about why people abuse power and how people can use it for good. This conversation is hosted by Voices for the Truth. If you haven't already heard of us, we are a 501c3 nonprofit that started back in March in the wake of the Dean Brewer news. We have from the outset been focused on organizing to support victim survivors and to prevent future harm. And one of the things that we strongly believe as an organization is that in order to fix this, we need to not only look for immediate solutions to the crisis that's happening, but also look for long-term solutions that are going to keep people safe moving forward. And something else that we truly believe as an organization is that in order for any change to happen, it has to happen with the fellowship. If we want to make this fellowship safer, we need to do it as a fellowship and as a community. So with that in mind, I'm really grateful that you all are giving me some of your time and attention today. But I don't know it all, very far from it. And there are going to be chances for me to learn from you and for you all to learn from one another, because I think that's really the only way that change happens. And I'm not going to be telling you like a list of demands or requirements for how to change this. I want you to bring your perspectives and your experience into this. This conversation is really more about building the capacity to make the changes that you're already working on. So this is going to be mostly focused on a social science perspective. The information that I'm going to be sharing with you is based on the research of Professor Julie Bacellana, who is a joint professor at the School of Government and the Business School at Harvard. And the reason I'm talking about it is because I'm an educator and I work with a number of faculty members on different subjects to create courses. And Julie and I have been working together for the better part of a year now to create a course about power. We're going to be looking at three main questions. What is power and how does it work? Why do people abuse power and how can we prevent it? And how can we use power for good? We're going to start off with that first question of what is power and how does it work? And I'm going to throw it right back at you. I'd love if you could share in the chat some of the words or phrases that come to mind when you hear the word power. What does power mean to you? I'm not looking for a right answer. What I'm really looking for are what are the beliefs or attitudes that you're starting this conversation with? Yeah, so please feel free to throw that in the chat. If a couple of you want to unmute and share out loud, that's also fine too. Yeah, Michelle says control. Leadership, says Taylor. Yeah, it's positive and negative valence, the idea of leadership. And authority. Yeah, absolutely. Authority and power are very closely related. And we'll talk specifically, Claude, about how they're related and in some instances, how they're not related. Welcome, Lois. Yeah, Martel says freedom to choose. We'll look at a very specific example of freedom to choose. And I'm also really grateful to see responsibility as part of this. So we're all walking into this with experiences of power. We have felt power. We have also all felt powerless. I think that's a feeling that many of us share right now, is powerlessness. But I want to offer a simple definition for the purposes of our conversation today. So we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we say power. In our conversation, power is the ability to influence someone's behavior. And I also want to just add a caveat here to say that I'm not in a position to offer spiritual guidance. That is not what my role is in this conversation. But I also know that many people here might associate the idea of power with God. And I really encourage you to bring that into the conversation. If verses are coming to mind or parables that speak to you or relate to what we're talking about, I'd love to see some of that. But I'm going to be mostly focused on those human to human interactions and how those work. And so for that reason, we're talking about the ability to influence someone's behavior. Sorry, Selkie, I don't know how to fix that, so it's probably best to just share the Zoom link. The ability to influence someone's behavior. Well, somebody said, power is about control. And the first time I read this definition of power, I thought, this sounds a lot like manipulation. That's the word that came to mind for me. Because if we're talking about influencing someone's behavior, that does imply a degree of control over them. And especially the context that we're meeting in right now, we have seen how manipulation has happened, how power abuse has happened. So it's understandable that many of us might have some of those negative associations with power as well. But I want to look at what power is a little bit more by talking about what power is not. And the first thing that power is not is dirty. And again, you might balk at that because here we are talking and meeting under circumstances where power has been used for something terrible. But I'd ask you to call to mind, just spend a couple seconds, a positive change that you've witnessed. This could be something from the truth. It could be something, nationally. It could be in the last year. It could be in the last decade. But I just want you to call that to mind. Something that I have really admired over the last year, one of the biggest changes that I've seen are the victim survivors who have come forward to share their story. That's a positive change I've seen. So it doesn't matter what positive change you're thinking about. It could be the civil rights movements. It could be something else. But these changes that are positive have also all happened through power. Because the truth is that power can be abused, but it is the only thing that brings about positive change. I want to emphasize that it is the only thing that brings about positive change. So I like my metaphors and I'll stretch them as far as they can go. So I like to think of power as being like a fuel source. So if you imagine our community, we're all in a car together. There is a source of fuel, and that is power. And we need power just to move forward in the same direction. But if somebody is steering us down a dark and dangerous path, that also takes power. If somebody wants to correct and bring us toward a safer path, that also takes power. In any instance, our community moves with the resource, the source of energy, the fuel that is power. So I'd really like to encourage you all as we move forward here to feel like you can embrace power. Because a lot of us might feel cautious and hesitant to think about power, but I promise you there are many, many people who aren't hesitant and cautious around it. And those people right now are the ones who are stepping up to power without hesitation. And they're the ones who are more likely to use it for ill rather than good. So until we have people who have good intentions stepping up to that power, positive change can never happen. So you might think to yourself, well, what power do I have? That leads me to the second myth of power, which is that power is for those at the top. And Claude, you mentioned authority, and that's very much a part of this conversation. But I want to give you a definition we can share for authority as opposed to power. Authority is your position in the hierarchy. So if we're thinking about the truth and how it's organized, you might imagine the National Board of Overseers, the workers. This is a hierarchy. If you're thinking about your place of work, obviously you have a manager, you have a boss, there's a CEO. Maybe you're lucky enough to work for yourself, but most of us have somebody that we report to in a hierarchy. But there are many instances of people who have authority without power and people who have power without authority. So I'll give you an example here. This is a study from Professor Bachelana's book. of a cigarette factory in the 1950s. And it feels really outdated. I don't know anybody who still smokes cigarettes, but I think it really illustrates this difference between authority and power. So who you're seeing here right now are the factory workers who are making cigarettes. They get paid per cigarette they make. And this is an incredibly strict operation. They have a timetable, they have machines, they know exactly what they're doing and when they're doing it. So you might imagine that this is a very hierarchical organization. But they actually, sorry, let me just let people in the waiting room in. What researchers found out when they went into the cigarette factory is that the factory workers weren't listening to the foremen who were above them in the hierarchy, and they weren't listening to the managers who were above the foremen in the hierarchy. So who were they actually listening to? Well, they found out that there were mechanics at the cigarette factory, and the mechanics were the only people with the knowledge to be able to fix the machines that these factory workers made cigarettes on. So a manager might tell this factory worker, I need you to be here by 8 o'clock and I need you to work until 8 o'clock. That factory worker had no incentive to listen to that manager, because if that machine didn't work, if the mechanic didn't fix that machine, then that factory worker wasn't making any money. So this is an example of people without authority. These are the mechanics who have power in this situation, and people with authority, the managers, without power. So the truth is that people with authority can have power, and people without authority can have power, and people with authority can lack power. So the third and final myth is that power is something that you possess. So if you don't get it from authority, how do you get it? Well, it depends on relationships and context. If we think about that example of the cigarette factory, the mechanics are people with power. But where does that power come from? It's given to them by the factory workers. And if you take the factory workers away, the mechanics lose power. Or you can imagine a situation in which, say, the managers replace all the machines with a completely new technology that the mechanics know nothing about. The mechanics' knowledge is still there. They have the same knowledge they had before, but their power is completely gone. So if you're somebody who's thinking, I don't have charisma, so I can't have power, or I'm terrified of public speaking, I can't have power, I'm terrified of public speaking too, I hope it's not super obvious, then the good news is that power is still something that you can have. Because again, it's not something that's fixed. It's not either there or isn't there. It's something that changes as the relationships and contexts change. So the real headline from all of these is, I want you to step up to power, and I want you to believe that you can have power. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens. So I'm going to put this back to you again and ask, what is it that, what do people in the truth value? This could be something big, it could be something moral and spiritual, it could be something small. What is it that people in this faith community value? And I'm particularly interested in people who are in the truth, but if you're outside of the truth, it's always interesting to hear observations from people who are from the outside as well. I'm just curious. Yeah, there's salvation. I think that's a huge one. I see two people adding on to that. Fellowship, honesty. Yep, two people saying fellowship. Status. Yeah, we'll talk about status a little bit. Chris, when I say the truth, I mean like the fellowship, the faith community, workers and friends, security and safety, appearance. Yeah, that's an interesting one as well. So almost all of the things that people are mentioning here, and feel free to keep adding, are what we're going to think about as resources. And I know resources are typically associated with things like lumber for example. But we're going to expand this definition to help us understand power to anything that people value that someone else controls. So a lot of these examples that we're talking about, fellowship was something that's mentioned. First, let me just say a word about material resources, which are the more obvious ones. Property, like convention grounds. Money, which, whether we like it or not, is a material good that helps the fellowship operate. Labor are people helping out around the convention grounds, physical materials, but then the intangible resources are also resources. So fellowship was something that a couple of people mentioned. I can't have fellowship unless you all are joining me in a conversation. I can't have fellowship unless other people are there to have that fellowship with me. So that fits under our understanding of a resource. There's visibility. Do other people see me? There's status. Do other people think highly of me? There's information. I think honesty was something that was mentioned. Are other people sharing facts with me? Are they being transparent with me? This is a resource because that's something that I need other people to offer me, okay? And then there's spirituality and morality. I want to pause on salvation, which I think was the first thing mentioned as a value. And I want to be clear again here, we're talking mostly about the human-to-human interaction. And whether or not these things are resources depends a lot on your belief. Okay, so if you believe that salvation comes directly from your connection with God, then that's not something that other people control your access to, and therefore it's not a resource. However, if you are someone who believes that your salvation comes from your fellowship, from your communion with other people, from your relationship with workers, then that becomes a resource by this definition because it's something that other people control your access to. So how does this relate to power? Power has everything to do with resources. There are two things we need to think about to understand power when it comes to resources. The first is, how valued is that resource? How much do people want it? And how exclusive is that resource? How many options do you have to access that resource? So if you start to think about these two things, you can start to build out a map of what power looks like. So on the left here, you see value and exclusivity, which are represented on the top and the bottom of these squares. And then you can think about your relationship with somebody else, your power and their power. Where does your power come from? Your power comes from how much someone else values a resource that you control access to. Their power comes from how much you value a resource they control access to. Your power comes from how many alternatives they have. If you control something that no one else controls, then you hold an immense amount of power. But if somebody's looking for a resource that you have that 1,000 other people in their network also have, then that's not as much a source of power. And likewise, if you're trying to get a valued resource from somebody and they're the only person that can offer that resource, that becomes a huge amount of power for them. But if you have other options, it's not as much a source of power. So we're going to look at a very simple example first, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about how this might work in the truth. So let's talk about an example where you have your great-grandmother's secret chocolate cake recipe, and it's the best chocolate cake recipe in the world. Everybody knows it. There's nothing else like it. That's a source of power. People want to eat that chocolate cake. But let's say you are a terrible baker, but you have somebody else who knows how to bake a cake, okay? You really want that cake. You have the recipe. That's your source of power. But somebody else has the knowledge of how to make that cake. That's their source of power. And then you can start to see how this power dynamic plays out. Well, they want the chocolate cake too, all right? What are your alternatives if they don't agree to bake this cake for you? You can order out, you can DoorDash it, or you can go to a bakery and buy a cake, which is a fine option, but you know it's not going to taste as good as that chocolate cake recipe that you got from your great grandmother. What about their power? Their alternatives. So they don't have this recipe without you. So they could make a pretty delicious pie. It wouldn't be as good as the chocolate cake, but they have other alternatives. So somebody mentioned the idea that power is about choice. And I want to highlight here this relationship. Both of them have reasonable alternatives. So they can leave this relationship at any point. And that's a healthy power dynamic because there's a balance here. If somebody wanted to, say this is you in a situation, there are other resources at play, and you don't really like how, for example, that person is treating your dignity or your safety. Well, then it makes a lot more sense to just order out than putting yourself in a dangerous situation, right? You have choices about where you go. The other thing that I want to highlight about this is that this is a mutually beneficial, mutually trusting relationship where both parties involved get to eat this delicious chocolate cake, which is a simple metaphor for a healthy relationship is one where there is a power balance and where both people involved understand what the other person is offering them and also understands what they offer to the relationship. So let's look at this through another hypothetical example. Let's look at a power dynamic for the elders, an elder, hypothetical elder, and a worker. So what might the elder have that the worker values in this situation? We're going to keep it simple again by looking at just one resource each for both sides. An elder has a home where fellowship can happen, where they invite other members of the truth to join them in communion. And that's something that a worker values, okay? What about the worker's alternatives? Well, in this hypothetical scenario, say there are 12 other elders in the field who also are offering their homes for fellowship. That becomes less of a source of power for the elder because the elder does not strictly control exclusively the access to homes for meetings. What about something that the worker has that the elder values? Let's imagine that this elder believes that spiritual fulfillment comes exclusively from a relationship with workers. Now, that's something that elder values immensely. In that sense, it becomes a huge amount of power for the worker over the elder. What about the elder's alternatives? Let's imagine in this scenario that the elder believes that the truth is exclusively the path to salvation. In this case, the elder's alternatives are none. If this is the exclusive path to salvation, and salvation is something that this elder values, as I'm sure he does, then that becomes a source of power for the worker. So you can start to see here why there's a power imbalance, right? But I want to make something really clear, which is that I'm not saying that the truth shouldn't have leadership. I don't want that to be a statement that's misconstrued here. We talked about the difference between authority and power, and in every organization, every community, it's important to have people we trust to make decisions on our behalf, to guide us, offer us guidance, to maybe represent us to other communities. So this is something that people can, we need in leadership. I also want to go back to the myth that power is dirty. So just because a worker has a lot of power, this hypothetical worker in this scenario, does not mean that they're abusing power. Those two things are not the same. Let's trust, as I think many of us might, that the worker here has good intentions, but just has a lot of power. That still might be a problem because the power difference is so great. Because if we imagine that the worker does start to abuse power in any sense, what recourse is there to hold this worker accountable with this power dynamic? Well, there really isn't much because of the power difference between them. So let's move on to the second big question here, which is, why does power abuse happen and how can we prevent it? When we leave the worker in that scenario, we're still imagining that they have good intentions. So why does power abuse happen? This worker in this scenario has a lot of power and they have intention to help their community, to help their fellowship. But we're going to illustrate a path to achieving power and what happens often on the way to achieving that power. We're going to look at two power traps. The first power trap is hubris. Hubris is overconfidence, a sense of invincibility. Nothing can touch me. I am on top of the world. So again, think back to that power map and how much difference there was between the worker and the elder. It's easy to understand how somebody with that amount of power might feel hubris, might feel like nothing can touch them. We did this study where they asked two groups of participants. One group, they asked to write about a time they felt powerful. And the second group, they asked them to write about a time they felt powerless. And then they asked those two groups, are you willing to bet $20 on the flip of a coin? So it's a 50-50 chance. It's either heads or tails. You either lose 20 bucks or you win 20 bucks. The people who were asked to write about a time they felt powerful, they 100% of the time in this study were willing to bet that 20 bucks because simply that feeling of being powerful in that scenario led them to say, well, I'm going to win this 20 bucks. Even though it was just a flip of a coin, it changed their perspective of what could happen and what would happen to them. And often the way that hubris resolves is this dramatic fall from grace. I think we can all think of examples, Icarus who flew too close to the sun. We can also think of people who were well respected and thought that they could get away with so much because they had this hubris. The second major trap is self-focus, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's looking inward and not thinking about the effect that you have on other people. A lack of perspective taking and a lack of interest in others. So I'll give you a similar study where they had an exercise for two groups. One, they made them feel more powerful. The other, they made them feel less powerful going into an experiment. And then they showed these two groups just one photo of a section of people's eyes and asked them to predict what the emotion that person was expressing just by seeing those eyes. And the group that felt more powerful walking into that experiment was significantly worse at being able to understand the emotions that other person was presenting on their face. So it happens immediately, but it also happens over the long term as people think of themselves as separate than, as better than, in many cases, people around them. And they start to shift that focus inward. The good news is that there are safeguards. For each of these two traps, there are two safeguards that can help us prevent ourselves from falling into the traps. For hubris, we have humility, which is the awareness of impermanence. What do you depend on? What do you have right now? Maybe it's your sense of power. Maybe it's your sense of safety, of comfort, of peace. What does that depend on? How much of that is chance? Instead of waiting for a bubble to burst and for people to fall from grace, to recognize that they depend on so much and so many people. How can we exercise daily this practice of thinking about my impermanence? What do I depend on? And similarly with self-focus, you have here the safeguard of empathy, which is an awareness of interdependence. Who do I rely on? For example, I know I'm doing a lot of talking here, but I want to spend a second to recognize that nothing I'm saying would matter at all if you weren't offering me your time and your attention. right? My ability to support this community in any regard, it just doesn't happen without many people who I support to a degree, but who are supporting me. So this just recognition of how we're relying on other people. Yeah, narcissism, exactly. So I'm going to stop talking for just a minute and ask you, what are some of the ways that we could cultivate empathy and humility? And I put this to you in particular because I think there might be some spiritual practices here. I think perhaps prayer could be a part of that, but I'm really interested in hearing from you. Maybe there's something that you do already that helps you in that practice. What comes to mind for you when you're thinking about how we cultivate empathy and humility? Yeah, thanks, Taylor. If somebody has something they'd like to share out loud, feel free to unmute yourselves. Yeah, introspection. So one of the things that people in the cases that this faculty member studied was meditation. But again, I think for a lot of people, maybe that introspection looks like prayer. Selke shared listening to other people's experiences and actually taking the time to experience what other people are experiencing. Yeah. I don't know what position you all are in as you're entering this conversation, but it's an interesting thing to think about how much you know about other people's experiences. Hear people's stories. Yeah, I think for a lot of us, seeing so many victim survivor stories has been a real practice in empathy. And a lot of that burden has fallen on the victim survivors to share their story. But how are we actually understanding experiences and making the effort ourselves to take that first step to understand what other people are going through? Pure fellowship, yeah. Honestly, just conversations with other people. Leading with kindness, I love that, Mardell, to ourselves as well as others. That's great. Asking people how I can support you. Yeah. As we're thinking about empathy, I do want to spend a moment to talk about, like, who are we empathizing with? And victim survivors are one we've talked about. But, you know, what are the experiences of workers? If you are a worker, how much do you know about what the elders or the friends in your field are experiencing right now, about the frustration and the hurt? We're also here in large part to talk about how we can protect the children in the fellowship. How often are we talking to children about what their experiences are, what they're feeling? Are they frustrated? Are they scared right now? Do they know? These are all ways for us to practice empathy. Yeah, Heather says, look to Jesus. Yeah. Yeah, again, I don't want to offer spiritual guidance, but my understanding is that Jesus was a picture of humility. And I think there are probably lots of verses that would speak to this practice of empathy and of humility. Thank you again, everyone, for sharing. And feel free to keep that going in the chat as I move forward. So the dangerous thing about these two traps, about hubris and self-focus, is that when you experience hubris, when you experience this feeling of I am invincible, you also think that you are immune to hubris. If you are so hubristic, you have so much hubris, you don't recognize your hubris. And similarly with self-focus, if you are so busy looking inward, then you can't recognize your lack of empathy and the effect that it has on other people around you. So that's what makes these traps particularly dangerous. And I would say almost inevitable. We're thinking about this same worker in this scenario who is approaching power, right? And we are trusting that they have good intentions. But with traps like hubris and self-focus, we cannot recognize for ourselves when we fall into those traps. It's nearly impossible. And that's why, while I urge you to practice these safeguards of humility and empathy, I will also leave you with, trust is never enough to prevent power abuse. You also need structure and process. So the intention that you bring into your journey to power is really important. But if you don't have a system of support that can make sure you're avoiding those traps, then you will still fall into them. How can we support one another in staying out of those traps? The first is accountability. Checks and oversights in the structure of the organization. So think about yourself. Who do I trust to be able to tell me if I'm abusing power? Who has enough power to stop me if I am abusing that power? Who's telling that person who has enough power over them to be able to stop them if they're abusing power? These are all systems of accountability and ways that we can support one another in avoiding the traps of power. Then there's power sharing. So if we talk about accountability, we're thinking about who has power above whom, who do we trust, again, to tell us, to stop us if we're abusing power. Power sharing is what happens when we spread power out among several people in order for us to make sure that power is not consolidated, but rather that we are a support system for one another and avoiding that power abuse. So I want to give you an example from our organization. So Voices for the Truth was founded with these ideas in mind. And so we have an executive director position, which is at the top of the organization. And this is the individual who has the most authority, right? So authority is something that can give us power, and there are risks for falling into these power traps for the executive director. So in order to avoid that, we have accountability. Above the executive director, we have a victim survivor advisory board. This is a group right now of 3. We have space for up to 5 of victim survivors who have insight into every decision that the executive director makes. So if the executive director were to fall into one of these power traps, there's a system of accountability that prevents that power trap from happening, that prevents that executive director from steering our organization into a place that is dangerous and harmful. So what if one of the victim survivor advisory board members falls into one of these power traps? Well, there are 2 of them. And again, we're looking for 2 others right now, so they can hold one another accountable. What if all 3 of them are abusing power? Well, we also have power sharing at the heart of our organization. So we actually designed these positions from the outset to be rotating ones. And so every year or so, we bring on new victim survivor advisory board members who can share their vision. So you can see here how we're avoiding this power imbalance in a way that invites power abuse. And we're creating systems of accountability and power sharing in order for us to avoid that as an organization and support one another in avoiding that. I'll pause for a second and just say, I am not going to share recommendations for what this might look like within the truth. Again, I really think that that's something I'd love to hear from you all on. I know that that is a complicated decision that might involve a lot and is something that requires a lot more conversation. But the situation we're in right now is that people are in these power traps. There is hubris and there is self-focus that we have witnessed and that we have experienced. So what happens in a situation where power abuse is happening, but we don't yet have systems of accountability and systems of power sharing? Yeah, yeah, Michelle, I think you were the one who shared in CCF a question of this. I think that's a really thoughtful thing that I'd love other people to chew on. So if there is power abuse and there is not yet systems of accountability and power sharing, the question becomes, how can we use power for good? How can we use power to prevent power abuse? Well, the simple answer to that is by rebalancing power, by finding that power balance again. So the third myth of power is that power is something you possess, that it's fixed. And we understand now that power is something that depends on context and depends on relationships. So how can we use that idea to change the dynamics of power in a way that keep us safe and keep those relationships, again, mutually beneficial, trusting, and safe? So we're returning to this grid here, looking at a simple power relationship between two people. Again, on the top, you have how much is a resource valued, and on the bottom, you have how exclusive is that resource. There are 4 things that we can do to change this balance of power, and they correspond with each of these 4 boxes. So a resource that they value is a source of power for you. How do you increase your power knowing this? You can use attraction, which is increasing their interest in your resource. If it becomes more valuable in their eyes, it becomes a greater source of power for you. Now, resources you value. How can you decrease the power they have over you in order to change the power dynamic? This is called withdrawal, and it's decreasing your interest in their resource. If you don't value it as much, it is not as much of a source of power for them. Then there are your alternatives, which you can expand. You can find other alternatives and other opportunities that decrease the amount of power they have over you. And then finally, there are their alternatives. If you find ways to consolidate, which is decrease the amount of alternatives they have, suddenly you have more power. So let's look at the 4 of these in the context of that example we were looking at before. Here's a power imbalance, right? And when we left the worker before, we saw how they might fall into the traps, the power traps, as they acquire more and more power. Let's imagine a scenario where they have fallen into these traps, and yet this power balance happened. An elder is saying that they want a safe church policy before they want a safe church policy to protect children in their field. They want a clear policy for how those people can be protected. Okay, but the worker is not willing to either consider or enforce such a policy. What are the elders' opportunities in this scenario? Well, let's look at those 4. There's attraction. In this scenario, the elder's source of power we're thinking about as the home they offer for fellowships. We can imagine that this elder builds a meeting home that now can host special meeting. It's not really a realistic scenario, but this is one example of how attraction might look. The thing that the worker values suddenly becomes more valuable in the worker's eyes and a little bit more of a source of power. Right, Michelle? Okay, what about the worker's power? That comes from the elder's belief that spiritual fulfillment comes through the truth, something that that elder values immensely. If the elder were to practice withdrawal in this situation, that would mean changing how much they value the resource that the worker has. So that would mean changing beliefs and perhaps even leaving meeting. And I want to recognize that this is a very drastic thing. Okay, we have seen people do it. And again, I think there are many situations in which there is power abuse where the best opportunity is to walk away. But we also have to recognize that for many people, this is not an option on the table. For many reasons, At the very best, changing a belief is hard, if not impossible. And again, I don't think my role here at all is to change what you believe or your spiritual practices. So that's what withdrawal would look like. But for many people, that's not an option. What about the elders' alternatives? Well, this is what expansion would be. Let's imagine that the elder finds other workers who say, I am willing to practice and enforce a safe church policy, and I am willing to offer you that fellowship. Okay. If you expand the alternatives, the elder regains power in this position. And if there isn't a worker in your field who's willing to practice that, well, maybe there are opportunities for Zoom meetings, for example. Michelle, I love that you wrote your own policy as well. Yeah. So that's an option for how people can reduce the amount of power disparity and the opportunities for power abuse in this situation. What about the workers' alternatives? This is where consolidation comes in. This worker is saying that I am not willing to consider a safe church policy to avoid SA and CSA in our community. Well, if that worker has 12 opportunities to host meetings and fellowships in their field, then that elder doesn't have much power. But imagine there's consolidation that happens, and that elder who's seeing concerns and asking for a safe church policy goes to other elders in their field and says, do you agree with this? Do you see the benefits of this? And do you also value the safety of our community? In that case, would you be willing to acknowledge that our homes cannot be safe until we enforce such a policy? If this situation were to happen, then the power that that worker has over the elders reduces, because the elders' power increases. There aren't as many alternatives for that worker. So I want to return back to this idea of power abuse and power manipulation, because a lot of what I'm talking about it feels dirty, right? We are talking about influencing someone's behavior. How do we make this worker consider a safe child policy? And I want to acknowledge that just as there are opportunities for power abuse for the worker in this situation, as the elder increases power, there are opportunities, there are chances for that power abuse to happen. So it's really important that we keep power in check, not only for the people who are in power now, but ourselves as we come to power. So I want to circle back to these power safeguards of humility and empathy, because we're imagining this journey of power and these traps that you can fall into, but how you can avoid those traps. But I want to focus on where it is we end up. If we have a journey toward power and we want to use it for good, where do we actually get in the end if we avoid these traps? In this research, we call it a higher purpose, which is collective orientation. Not how can I use power for me? How can I share power with others? And how can I empower others? And then power is responsibility. I loved seeing that right at the outset. Ted, I believe it was you who shared power as a responsibility. This is not something for me to just use and wield without consequences. This is something that I need to be careful with because it is dangerous. But for lack of a better word, it is also powerful and it can be used for good. So I want to end with one last question and ask you all, what is your higher purpose? What is it that if you were to use this power for good, how would you do that? Maybe you could share a group or a person that you want to empower. What is the change that you want to make for the better? I'll share my example. My higher purpose, the reason I'm here today, the reason I've been involved since March, is creating a safer fellowship, supporting victim survivors and preventing future harm. So that's a higher purpose that I have as I approach cautiously power. I would love to hear from you all. What are the changes you want to make? What is it that you'd like to be able to use power for? Great, Ted. Yeah. And we need as many of us with that mission as possible, Ted. So I'm glad you share that. Yeah, Mardell says safety. Mhm. Yeah, how do we find safety? And again, I think it is very reasonable for us to step away from relationships in which power abuse is harming our own safety. But in our journey to safety, how are we empowering others? How are we thinking about this as a collective effort, and finding safety for everyone? Yeah, love. Again, this is a very academic focused conversation, and I really do appreciate you all sharing ideas like love, uh, because what we're looking for from relationships, we're talking about this in this very clinical perspective of power and mapping, but what those relationships ultimately we want to look like really are loving ones. Yeah, knowledge sharing is a huge part of it. Knowledge itself is a resource, and so if somebody is hoarding that knowledge and not being transparent, um, that is an example in itself of power abuse. So being able to share that knowledge, transparency and honesty and humility, love it. Selkie, I want to empower people to recognize their own value, that they deserve safety, kindness, and love, and that they do not need to tolerate anything less than that. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So it is 9 o'clock. You all have been here for most of an hour, and I won't keep you any longer if you choose to drop. I will say, oh, sorry, just reiterate a couple of key ideas while people are still sharing their higher purposes. Everyone has the opportunity and responsibility to use power for good. When there is an extreme power imbalance, power abuse is effectively inevitable, regardless of the intention of the person in power. Those power traps are themselves very powerful, and there's no way to avoid those without support from other people in our community. The way to prevent power abuse is by organizing a community in that way. So again, we're talking about accountability and power sharing. So this is the first conversation that's planned in a series of conversations about how we can make our fellowship safer. The next one's going to be focused on how to make positive community change. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you form relationships with people to try and start to make that change together. What are the roles in a change-making process? What happens when people are resistant to change? So that's the focus of the next conversation. And then also we do have a short 8-question survey at this link here. And Taylor, if you wouldn't mind dropping in that chat for people to click on. Oh, thank you, Selkie. Which is just a way for us to learn about what you're thinking about in this conversation. There's going to be an opportunity in there for you to share more of your thoughts on power, which we're going to post to CCF and Facebook to start to generate this conversation and ideas for people who weren't able to join today and for people who were. Yes, so I'd appreciate it if you could fill that out, but there's no obligation there. So I will let you go all off to your evenings if you would like to, but I'm also going to stick around and stop talking for a little bit, let others ask questions if they have them, or again, share ideas if they'd like to. Thank you again for joining. Yeah, I really appreciate your time and attention. We're looking to making the next one more opportunities for you to be able to share with one another. But I appreciate you being willing to listen to me share some of these ideas, and I really hope they were helpful for you all. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Roland. Thank you, Claude. Thank you, everyone who joined. Yeah, thank you, Selkie. I know there's a strong showing from the RMOOC contingency tonight, so. Thank you, Michelle, for saying I ran it like a public speaking expert. Again, terrified of public speaking, but I try and hide that when I do have to do the public speaking. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, so Sherry, we will post a recording of this video online, so the whole conversation will also be there. We're going to post the slides as well, and then we'd love for you to share thoughts in that survey there, because we're going to post sort of a follow-up summary of some of the ideas that I shared, but also some ideas that you all came to this conversation with, or maybe that were sparked by this conversation. Thank you, Amy. Thank you again for joining. I really appreciate it. I'll also give a quick shout out to voicesforthetruth.org, which has a number of other resources available as well. And we're also looking to always expand that resource library. So if there are questions that you all have, again, none of us are absolute experts in anything, but we are here as a conduit to help you find some of those answers you're looking for, or to generate those answers with you. So I'd love if you could check out voicesforthetruth.org. Michelle, that's great. Thank you so much for that. I might message you. We can see if maybe we post that as well as the recording. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate you coming. And I hope to see some of you on the next call as well. Yeah, Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yeah, I just one thing that I think is kind of interesting and important to maybe flesh out a little bit more for people is how these more examples of how these power dynamics might look in relationships. And I think also a lot how it interplays in between generations of people. Like if there's if one party is an elder and the others are younger, and then the kind of dynamic that plays out between older and younger workers. I shared a lot with some of the workers in Washington about power and control, from a domestic violence standpoint, because that's my wheelhouse, as I'm an advocate for victims, and trying to explain to them how those same kind of dynamics can play out in the worker companion relationship, and real life examples of what that might look like. Because I feel like a lot of the folks have seen examples of this in when they have workers staying in their homes, or they've been treated with microaggression and little abuses that they may not yet have identified as abuse or a misuse of power.
Yeah.
I just think examples are really helpful, and I really appreciate the examples that you brought already about what you mean by power, because I feel like some people have not yet really identified these things as power, I guess.
Yeah.
Or lack of power, if you get
I have like some initial thoughts to that. And first of all, thank you so much for your question, and for all the work you're doing as well. I really appreciate it. I've seen you on the forum, so I know there's a lot of dedication there. But I'm curious, it sounds like you are also thinking of these examples. I mean, you raised this dynamic of an elder and younger worker. I wonder, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of what maybe you've seen or what you're thinking about when you talk about that.
Um, so, what I've seen in worker relationships is, it, well, there's financial abuse. That's one part of it. Um, there's just, withholding of approval or withholding of any kind of information. So I've seen younger companions have no idea where they're even going within the next couple of days, having no freedom to step away to deal with family issues or with their own personal needs.
Yeah.
I've seen um, I've seen younger companions being forced into medical decisions that they didn't really want because someone else in charge of them decided that maybe they do not need to take a medication or they should or whatever. They somehow their choice is not being recognized in that area.
Mhm.
Um, so if you go around, I don't know if you're familiar with the power and control wheel that the Duluth model.
No.
Um, it's kind of widely shared in the
Oh, I think you're muted, Rebecca.
it examples for all the different types of abuse that can be in an unhealthy relationship. And if you look around at that model, you can see, or at least I can see, where there are opportunities for abuse
Hmm.
in these relationships that line up exactly with that, even though it's not a romantic relationship necessarily.
Cool.
Still those unhealthy aspects. So another thing I've seen is like a total lack of privacy where a younger companion is not allowed to have any alone time, even in places where anyone would consider privacy being
Hmm.
a norm.
Hmm.
Like someone walking in on them in the bathroom when they're changing, just a complete lack of control over any part of their life. And so um, I I tried to share some of this at a worker workshop, and I got a fair amount of pushback, as you can imagine. But I tried to give really concrete examples of like what this might look like because I've seen it,
Yeah.
and it has all the classic symptoms like it would in a abusive relationship,
Yeah.
any kind of abusive relationship.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's not surprising at all that you got pushback. And one of the things we'll talk about at the next session is entrenched power, and why change is so hard. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I'm really interested in this framework. Maybe we can share that out as part of the follow-up. Um, but as you're talking, I'm putting it into this framework of value and exclusivity of resources. So you talked about like approval, right? If you're a younger
Yeah.
worker, an elder companion, you value so much their approval, and that's something that only they
Right.
can give you. And if they're also controlling the money in that situation, that's a pretty challenging power dynamic. And then you think about the exclusivity. This is not only a person that you revere, perhaps in just a personal sense, but also in a spiritual sense. This is also somebody who your employment relies on. And and so when it comes to the exclusivity, what opportunities does that younger worker have to find those elsewhere if that power is being abused? So a big part of it is the exclusivity dimension of it.
Right.
Um, I'm happy to keep following this up too, but I want to leave space for other people if they have questions or thoughts. Again, I think everyone here is an expert in their own experience and their own perspective, and has a lot of value to add. So I'd encourage you to pop in with thoughts if you have them. Yeah. Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate it. You joining and all of your thoughtful comments as well. Thank you. Yeah, Michelle, I share that concern a lot. I want to acknowledge that like there are workers who are trying. I believe we have workers who joined tonight. And so I want them to be a part of the change that happens. But I think we can all think of examples where there was a lack of willingness to change. And so thinking about how to rebalance that power is one way to think about it. But the focus of the next conversation is really about, if there is somebody with an immense amount of power who's not willing to change, how do we make that change ourselves? And so I hope part of this left you feeling a little empowered, and that there is an opportunity to do that. And I'd love to talk with you all more about what those steps look like. I'm so sorry to hear that, Amy. That is absolutely unacceptable. I mean, this is a clear instance of power abuse. And, I can imagine somebody in that position who was abusing that power felt no guilt or remorse about it. And it is unacceptable, like Donovan said. Well, great. If no one else has any further questions or thoughts they want to share out loud, I'm going to go ahead and end the call. I'm on East Coast time, so it's about my bedtime. But I would encourage you to keep this conversation going in CCF, on Facebook, wherever it is that you're organizing, in your groups, perhaps in your meetings even. And I would love to hear back from you all. That survey, I'd love if you could fill it out, but I want this to be a communication line that we keep open. So please reach out to me with questions too on any of those channels, and I'd love to hear from you all. Thank you again so much for everything that everyone's shared, and again for your time and attention.